So, thank you. I'd like to welcome the panel for their attendance here to judge these just 4 grants that we have today. One thing to bear in mind, of course, for the audience is that these grants, you're seeing them maybe for the first time. As you have heard, they will have been through peer review, a triage process after external peer review. So only the top 40 or 50% of grants tend to make it to this panel. So we've already got the cream, and that's what we're trying to decide which of these, if any, are worthy of funding. This panel meeting is unusual maybe in another way, and that's for our meeting today, we have enough money to fund all of these grants. And that's never the case normally. So of the 40 or 50% that get through triage, there's usually only sufficient funds for 40 or 50%. So again, today we're in a slightly rose-tinted spectacle position. And the final part, which again is slightly awkward, is that amazingly, all of the panel members are totally conflicted for every single grant. So in the real world, we'd be outside the door, but that's not going to work very well. So we'll suspend disbelief. Okay, so as usual, we've got on average maybe 10 minutes or so for each grant, and I'm just going to take them in the order we have them. So our first grant is a 3-year project grant from Carmine Parianti and colleagues at KCL, and they want £370,000 to study a novel model of fatigue induced by interferon alpha. And we're going to have that reviewed by Tony.
Thank you very much. I think in the real panel, probably the panel chair would have had to explain something about the scheme, because this is it's a strategic call. I don't know whether that counts as one of the managed mode or some other description. So it's not entirely come out of the blue. There's been a call for research in this area. Obviously, this feels very contentious, and it's the result of successful lobbying by the outside politicians, members of the royal family, etc., to get the MRC to fund this. And they would also have succumbed to the lobbying that this was not considered under the mental health and neuroscience panel, because a lot of the advocates are against a sort of psychiatric view of the syndrome. So I think the MRC would have been under pressure to fund research that doesn't look at first glance like it's psychiatric research, but it's good research in this topic. But obviously the applicant would have been very clever in thinking, this means that put in anything half decent and we're going to get it funded. Now obviously they would have put in their best grant anyway. So it's a sort of slightly unusual setting. But let's just take the project as it comes. So chronic fatigue syndrome is a very controversial condition. There's been a lot of work that suggested that inflammation or infection is something to do with the etiology. People often feel that the condition started following a viral infection or other kind of infection. And indeed, when various inflammatory markers are measured in people with chronic fatigue syndrome, as it were, idiopathic chronic fatigue syndrome, a lot of these markers come out as being different from healthy controls. But studying that in the real world is very difficult. So what the applicants have suggested here is that they've got a model for chronic post-infectious fatigue, if you like. And the model is that people with hepatitis C who are treated with interferon alpha almost invariably develop a kind of chronic fatigue syndrome. They certainly get an acute fatigue syndrome, but if you wait long enough, even after 6 months, a lot of the people are still complaining of fatigue, and they're arguing that the other symptoms, along with fatigue, mental fatigue, pain, and so on, quotes, flu-like symptoms, make it just like idiopathic chronic fatigue. So they think it's a very good model, the advantage being that you can time its onset very accurately, and you can prospectively measure various markers and risk factors. So I think that's a very clever idea. So the study is a kind of cohort study and then a case control comparison. So they're going to take people with hepatitis C on the beginning, starting out on their treatment with interferon, which apparently can go on for about 6 months. They're going to sort of follow them through to the end of treatment. They're going to keep following them up for another 6 months, and if they're still fatigued at the end of that 6 months, that's the sort of group they're interested in. It's sort of experimental chronic fatigue type syndrome. So they say they're going to start off with 100 people, and they think that by the end they'll have 50 who meet their criteria for chronic fatigue. And all along they'll have measured various stuff before they've even started treatment and then during the course of treatment. And then they're going to compare these experimental chronic fatigue patients with 50 common or garden chronic fatigue patients and I think 50 healthy controls. So I think the basic idea is very interesting. They've got this opportunity to measure various cytokines and other immune markers before the person has turned out to have chronic fatigue, and they can compare those between the different groups. One of the and they're also going to look at lots of potential mediating factors. So why is it that some people end up with this chronic fatigue type syndrome and others don't? Is it that they've got pre-existing psychiatric problems? Is it because they've got mood problems? Is it because of other physical things? So they're going to measure all of those things as well, and they're going to do some slightly blue sky stuff. They're going to measure tryptophan metabolites, which is a sort of biological risk factor for depression, and they're going to do some fancy stuff on what is it? Gene expression by looking at leukocyte gene expression analysis, which is not my field. So I think it's an important piece of research. It could answer important questions about chronic fatigue from a biological point of view. What I think the weaknesses are that the obvious design would be to compare the, say, 50% who end up with chronic fatigue from the cohort with the remaining people in the cohort who didn't develop chronic fatigue. That would have been the most obvious and powerful design. As it is, they're comparing this rather unusual group with a group with common or garden chronic fatigue who may well have some immunological abnormalities, but they won't have anything like the stuff that the other group has because they've had hepatitis C for perhaps years. And then where the healthy control group come in, I don't know, because they're bound to be very different. The applicants say that they'll take care of that in some complicated statistical modeling, but they don't really explain what that means, and that was picked up by one of the reviewers. And they don't discuss whether, with all of those measures, psychiatric measures, biological measures, whether really having just 50 in each group is going to be enough. The other potential weaknesses is the recruiting that cohort in the first place. It's based on, I think, some reasonable assumptions, but we all know from this board that projected numbers of patients is always over-optimistic. On the other hand, they've got some contingency plans. They can go to other centres and recruit from there. So in sum, I think it's not a perfect application. It could probably be improved with at least a better explanation of how all of that information is going to be condensed and summarized. But I think it's a fundable project.
Okay, I noticed that there's an existing NIH application that sounds a bit similar. Do we have any knowledge about potential overlap?
Well, it's a very productive group, and a lot of work is going on, and I think the infrastructure that the NIHR provides is probably going to be very important for the other clinical groups. But specifically, I'm not sure I can answer your question about that.
Okay. Well, that could be something that if it was picked up at the triage meeting at the office, would then go back to the applicant and say, tell us why these applications are different, because we're not going to double funds.
And again, there's no pilot data in this grant, which is increasingly unusual, but then maybe that's not so surprising, where the pilot data is a natural experiment that goes on with hepatitis C treatment. Anyway.
Yes.
So,
well, in responding to, basically the reviewers were almost all positive except one which was slightly less positive, but the positive reviewers didn't really make even many constructive criticisms. So the only critical reviewer was concerned about recruiting enough people and raised how this slightly more exploratory work with gene expression, how did that come in? And also about the statistical analysis, they wanted a bit of clarification. And in responding to that, the applicants did say, well, they do have a sort of pilot study ongoing at the moment. They have already started to recruit some patients. They might have about 20. And they can add those to the new cohort to make sure that they'll get the numbers. What they didn't do, though, is what they could have done is said much more about the expected baseline measures on the chronic fatigue, the common or garden chronic fatigue patients, to say, would they be more or less matched in terms of age and gender? What differences would you expect to find in IL-6 measures or depression scores? They will have had all of that information, I'm sure, and the application would have been much stronger if they'd sort of showed us some of that information.
I mean, I agree. I thought the rebuttal was generally good, and it answered the one critical reviewer well, and it had, I think, a unique experience for me of including a whole number of patient testimonials as to why we're funding this grant. Okay, so Tony, on that basis, how would you score this grant?
I'd give it 7/8. Low 8, let's say.
And then I would ask everyone else to score the grant.
Do we get a chance to
Yep,
comment?
sorry, yes, if you've looked.
Because I take on board everything that Tony said, but I have a major concern with one aspect of this grant, is that I just do not think it is powered to find anything effective at all. And I have major concerns. And as a statistician on the panel, I do feel it's my role to point this out. There's a collection of 500 patients, if only there were 550 patients that they're comparing between two groups. They're going to look at multiple biomarkers, gene expression. They're doing a lot of comparisons. The power calculation uses a standard p-value of 0.05, and it says it's powered to find an effect size of a Cohen's d of 0.5. That's a massive effect size. And I just have major concerns that this study will do anything that it is set out to do here.
Okay. Comment? Oliver? Yeah, so but I really shouldn't have asked for your score before I take the other guys. I hadn't realised anyone had read it. So with any other comments from the panel?
Yeah.
You've all read it.
Yeah, well, first of all, to say the good things. I mean, I think they're an excellent team with a lot of track record, so that kind of sort of immediately made me excited. And it's an interesting idea, and they're really sizing of an opportunity with these people who have HIV, hepatitis C. But I agree with my colleague statistician. Most of my concerns, I mean, obviously I'm not an expert in this field, are to do with methodology because my bias is epidemiology. I agree that power calculation is an issue not only because of that, but also because of the analysis. They talk about mediation, moderation. Then you begin to think about statistical interactions and so on and so forth. Those are all kinds of power thirsty procedures. So that kind of curbed my enthusiasm. Then, in terms of the design of the study, I have to agree with my colleague David here that I felt that the most appropriate design was a longitudinal research design. There may be a reason, a practical reason why they didn't do that. And they chose this sort of case control following a cohort for 6 months. Which are, case controls are, the key of case controls is choosing good controls. And I don't think that they explain well enough, how they're going to choose the controls. So all those things, and then they don't mention really what potential confounders. They talk about univariate analysis in the end. There may be the possibility of introducing some other more sophisticated thing. So I was quite worried about that side of the story.
Okay. Any more comments?
Yep. Can you hear me with the microphone? So I'll say a couple of things, Tony, about the design. I think it's quite logical to have a healthy control group because the objective there was to create a predictive model for persistent chronic fatigue syndrome. So the inclusion of a healthy control group makes sense if you're comparing persistent and non-persistent. Also, I would like to give credit to the investigator for the feasibility work they've done in reaching out to the living units all across South London. And that involves quite a lot of work and relationship building with clinicians. So in terms of recruitment, I think that's a solid plank, something very positive. We also have to bear in mind that he's someone who's new to chronic fatigue, and that's something which I think the council is looking for, to bring new investigators on board to this area. And finally, I have to agree, I'm a little bit mystified by the statistical analysis, which is rather vague. It says that we'll use a variety of statistical approaches, mentions random forest and support vector machines, but I'm not an expert in either of those, and it's not enough for me as a non-specialist to judge whether there are adequate number of participants for the analyses proposed.
Okay, so I think we've heard enough. So we're going to judge the grant on the basis of prepared. So Tony, let's start again, yeah?
I better stick to what I said, but it's about there.
So, 8.
Low 8.
You should elaborate.
I gave it a 7.
7.5.
Only because Carmen is here.
Well, that's being nice to him. Okay, so we move on. We'll come back to the scoring. So I thought it might be worth taking the Layar grant next, Jennifer Layar. Childhood maltreatment, emotional consequences and potential intervention. That's an unusual grant in the sense that it's seeking some funding under the Global Health Scheme. And that is with you, Richard, yeah?
All right, okay. Well, obviously, child maltreatment is an important issue, and nobody will dispute that. I'm just going to go straight into the project, actually. I mean, I felt that this is a very ambitious and complex study that aims to improve our knowledge and understanding of child maltreatment and the consequences, cognitive and emotional consequences, in child and adolescent laborers in North India and Nepal, which is going to be followed on by the development of cognitive intervention to improve the emotional resilience among these abused child laborers. And at the end, sort of, in the final part, the intervention testing, they include a subsample in the UK as well. So I feel the topic is obviously important, and apparently from what the applicants are saying, there isn't much known of this problem, at least in low and middle income countries. I felt that the team was very good. I mean, it's excellent. They've done a lot of work in this field. There is good innovation in terms of the intervention that they are trying to develop and test eventually. And it could lead into new insight into the mechanisms explaining the consequences of childhood maltreatment early in life and subsequent in later life. The management strategy, I thought it was realistic. The only thing that I was concerned is that more than half of all resources requested were to stay in the UK for a study that fits into the global health agenda. I thought that was a little bit off-putting. The plan, to me, seems really ambitious. They have a very tight schedule for a wide range of tasks to be accomplished, and I was not entirely reassured with the way some of the risks were going to be approached and eventually mitigated. I mean, the possibility that some of the children may experience serious mental health problems, and the likelihood that these children would be treated in the low and middle income countries, India and Nepal, were not really discussed in detail. I wasn't reassured that those kids will probably be treated. This field, to me, really is sort of play with ethical issues, and my impression is that they were not sufficiently addressed in the proposal. One of the things that I immediately thought it was about legal issues, but that would require knowledge of the laws in each one of the countries, which nothing has been mentioned in the proposal. I'm not sure about the rationale behind involving 3 countries in this study. Perhaps one of the low and middle income countries could have been dropped, but to reduce the complexity of managing a project like this. The methodologies, I felt they were reasonably adequate, but adding 4 projects, this is 4 projects, all of them are linked together and one depends on the other. If one of them fails, the next one, it would be meaningless, really. I thought that, in my view, that the first 2 studies were enough for a proposal, given all the uncertainties surrounding this type of research in this particular setting. There were a number of methodological issues that made me concerned. Each one of these 4 studies kind of use a different study design. The first one seems to be a cross-sectional survey. The second one seems to be a case control study. The third one seems to be a mini RCT. And the fourth one, if the RCT is effective, the fourth one, it would be, there would be a reason to carry out the fourth one, which is more like sort of an experimental one. And as with the previous one, I felt that, perhaps, a more longitudinal approach to establish the direction of causality would be useful. The reviewers and myself included were unsure about the sample size required to test most of these research questions. I think the applicants are banking on massive effect sizes, something that adds to the very many uncertainties surrounding this project. On more than one occasion, the applicants suggest that they will be testing for interaction, once again, they will probably be struggling for power. I'm not sure, but I couldn't see there was any statistician involved in the study. There are a number of other issues around, blindness in assessment, possibility of introducing bias in the measurement, which are not discussed at all. So, although the topic is important, I'm not sure about the potential usefulness of these and the sustainability in low and middle income settings. The applicants say it is simple, but I did not find it very simple. It may be because I'm not well acquainted with this type of research. My impression is that there is a lot that needs to be explored before launching an intervention like this into low and middle income countries. A lot more pilot work needs to be done before one can really test the efficacy of an intervention. As mentioned by one of the reviewers, yet unclear how all the dots will connect, leading to an impact on the well-being of these traumatized children. A diagram explaining all the mediating, moderating factor leading to better mental health outcome would have helped me to understand better, but it wasn't there. Overall, I think that the sheer ambition to cover too much ground has undermined the feasibility and possibly the potential impact of this proposal. And my suggestion to the applicant would be to split the proposal in parts and apply with separate projects in a sequential manner to reduce the uncertainties and have more space to argue their case.
Okay, well I think today we're judging the grant that's submitted. It's not our job to rewrite the grant for them, so I think we should carry on for the moment with evaluating the proposal in front of us. And if we wanted to consider some other option, we could decide that subsequently maybe. But just while you're here, I see that 2 of the external reviews actually were quite low scores, 3, and 5. Were those 3s really very critical? They didn't seem 3s to me. They seemed more enthusiastic than a 3 would.
Well, for the audience here, I think, this is the thing about, rating. Reviewers, they don't use the same rule, really. I don't think they were very critical, but they gave it 3.
No, it's our job to interpret their comments. We may have to modify the numbers. Okay, thank you. And any other comments on this grant?
Yes, I have concerns about this grant from beginning to end. Having spent part of my research career working with disadvantaged children in India, I think I know something about the challenges faced in this kind of study. First of all, we're dealing with a very vulnerable population, and I'm wondering, for example, the issues of informed consent, which haven't, I think, been adequately explored here.
Were raised by 2 of them, and the rebuttal makes some attempts. And I think, again, just stepping out of character for a second, the office are very sharp on ethical issues. So if there were questions, almost certainly they would have been addressed quite extensively before the science was judged. Correct? Yeah. So I think we'd have to assume that, well, no, this is 5 years ago, but we'd assume that they would have been aired. I think that's the mood now. But carry on, yes.
I also would like to know more about the clinical service that would be offered to these to the participants. So, as well as being included in a research study, what long-term clinical service would be offered to them. And really wondering about the long-term impact for participants who are going to be in the study. So, is learning CPM going to have a long-lasting impact for them, and does that merit their inclusion in a research study like this?
That was also raised by one of the reviewers. You weren't convinced by the rebuttal. It sort of waved their hands and said, it may be useful for them.
As Ricardo said, I think the number of procedures, the number of sensors is all really too ambitious. Just for example, they're proposing to do 2 EEGs on each subject. And I think, doing EEGs myself in London, it's hard enough to get sufficient long-term retention to get that kind of quite difficult data. Is going to be very challenging indeed. I think they're proposing far too much. I think the risks are too high for this. Also, some of the tasks that are proposed, like the potential capture paradigm, the training in CDM, to be sure that there's enough cultural validation. The text that we're presented with is in English, and I've missed it. I didn't see translation into translation and validation into different languages.
Okay, so a number of criticisms. So on that basis, though, maybe we can score the application as is. Richard, 6. Others?
Yeah, I'd give it a 6 as well. I think the amount of extra technical investigation on something that was so obviously about social adversity and psychopathology, which is a very good topic for research. All those other things are completely unnecessary and expensive and bound to fail. So, despite there being a good core, I'd give it a 6.
4.
6.
I'll give it a 7. Okay, doing well. So let's move on. I wanted to take the Peters one last because it's a slightly different type of application from the past. So maybe we could move on to our NERG. So this is Deepak Shrivastava, also from King's College, looking at estrogenic modulation of neural circuitry and actually its relevance to schizophrenic states. And this is a NERG asking for 473,000, and it's with you, Catherine.
Yep. So mechanisms of estrogenic modulation of neural circuitry. This is a really interesting, original and creative grant from a very well accomplished, so far anyway, young investigator. We know that estrogens and sex hormones can influence the development of cortical neurons. Can you hear me okay? And also the formation of dendrites and synapses.
I still can't hear you.
Do I need to come closer? Sorry, I'll start again. Can you hear me okay now? Yeah. So we know that estrogens can influence the development of neurons in the brain and dendrites and synapses. But we don't know how estrogens do this. Now, estrogen-mediated regulation of neural circuitry might be clinically important because estrogen's been used as an adjunctive therapy in schizophrenia. Part of the pathology in schizophrenia and other brain disorders, including cognitive function, is disturbance of the neural circuitry. Now, estrogen itself has long-term adverse effects on the cardiovascular system and also increases risk for cancer. So any novel therapies that act downstream would be a useful advance. And to identify such downstream targets, we need to characterize the molecular mechanisms by which estrogen influences cortical circuitry. So what the investigator here proposes is 3 distinct but related objectives. First, he's going to use in utero electroporation, which is a way to introduce molecules into the mouse embryo. And he's going to introduce short hairpin RNA targeted against the enzyme aromatase, which is necessary to produce estrogen in the brain. So the short hairpin RNAs are going to block the synthesis of neuronal aromatase and thereby block brain-derived estrogen. So it will leave the somatic estrogen production intact, but the brain-derived estrogen far outweighs the somatic produced estrogen. And then he's going to use some very fancy laser scanning microscopy to look at the effect of brain estrogen on migration of cortical neurons, the lamination of the frontal cortex, the formation of dendrites, and the formation of synapses. So that in itself is a very exciting objective that he's got there. And the second objective is to look at the molecular pathways required for modulating dendritic spine density in vitro, in cultured rat neurons. And he's particularly interested in a pathway known as EPAC2 RAP, which is something that he's already published on and shown has relevance for estrogen modulation. At the same time, he's going to look at different estrogen receptors. Oh, thank you. I think just not close enough. To see which particular estrogen receptors are involved in that molecular pathway. And his third aim is to see which estrogens are able to modulate particular receptors. Those are the NMDA and AMPA glutamate receptors. He's going to look at the expression of the receptors and see if the EPAC2 RAP pathway is required for trafficking of the receptors from inside the cell to the cell membrane. So overall, I thought it was an extremely well-written proposal with a compelling topical rationale, a detailed and technically advanced scientific plan, and really a high level of grantsmanship, made it very easy to read. In terms of research quality, I thought the rationale was good and would likely lead or contribute to advances in our knowledge of cognitive function and health and disease, and also might lead to the development of novel therapies that lack the long-term adverse effects of estrogen therapy. It's very innovative. He's using state-of-the-art methods, including short hairpin RNA inhibition and cellular imaging. I'm not an expert on molecular neurobiology, but that's how it struck me. The project management plans appear to be very realistic and well considered. I wasn't too sure about the number of animals that he proposed and how he worked that out. He didn't tell us that. But he's given us extensive feasibility data and pilot data at every objective to support the plans, and that gives us some confidence that he's able to do what he's planned to do. He's certainly experienced in using the techniques, and he's referenced every technique and every paper that he's used those techniques in. I'm also impressed in the way that through every objective and sub-objective he's outlined very realistically the pitfalls of those experiments and suggested some alternative experiments that he could do instead. Looking at his CV, he's very well accomplished. He spent 7 years in Chicago and was a postdoc, senior postdoc, and then assistant professor. And he's published very well. He's had a NARSAD award, which puts him right up there. I think he's found himself some very impressive collaborators here at King's, and the work that he proposes fits really well with the strategic aims of the department and the division of neuroscience at King's. So it's a very good fit for where he's working. In terms of impact, I think this is a really exciting new therapeutic avenue for schizophrenia, for disorders of cognition, and related disorders. We know that this is a very common and disabling global condition, and he's made a very good impact pathway there. I have no ethical concerns. And I think for the money he's requested, most of it, I think about 3/4 of it or 2/3 of it, is for 20% of his salary and a whole-time postdoc, which I think he'll need, and about 200,000 on consumables, which I think is reasonable given that this is animal work. So that's it.
Okay. I mean, one thing I'd say about this application is it's closer to my field, so I voted it quite closely. It seems to me that we have a lot of grants here which come in 3 parts or multiple parts, and there's a problem if the latter parts depend upon the first part. So in this case, he wants to use electroporation to knock down aromatase.
Yeah.
And of course, as several of the reviewers said, why not just use an inhibitor? There's lots of good inhibitors out there. So he wants to use a technique for which he doesn't provide pilot data, but that is going to be sufficient. So if that fails, either on technical grounds, that he simply doesn't get enough knockdown with the shRNA, or if it fails biologically, that knocking it down doesn't change anything because all of the estrogens are actually not coming from the brain that are important, they're coming from the peripheral tissues, then actually parts 2 and 3 have no meaning. And so this is a common problem that we have to face, and I would argue that that we would either judge it as it is, or en masse. He's obviously a very high-flying researcher, very strong CV, so if anyone can do that, I think that he could. We either do that, or we would ask for it's possible to set milestones, to say that we award a grant that's contingent upon some key objective, some milestone being reached. I don't know if that's increasing or not. I mean, we tend not to like to do it. Or we could even send it back and say we have to demonstrate this with some pilot data, and then we could ask for an early resubmission in the anticipation that it will look good.
I agree on the contingency aspect, and I think the second two aims are less interesting if the first aim is not met. Yeah.
It's a sort of generic problem for many grant writers.
Can I ask on that? So we've got a brilliant new investigator here who I think all agreed is up there in his field. It's a new investigator. We want to encourage him. We've commented how good his collaborators are. I mean, doesn't that mean we have confidence that he will deal with any setbacks in the grant anyway?
I don't think so. I think that the game is that you have to persuade the panel that what you're proposing is achievable, and that's why pilot data is an important part of almost every grant. And the pilot data demonstrates, not necessarily the outcome, it demonstrates that the question you're posing, that an answer will be forthcoming. And so if you don't have that contingency now, you don't have that certainty, I think it does create problems. I know it's setting the bar is going up and up and up. That's what it means. So I'd say in general there can be less hand waving. This scheme doesn't give money to smart people to allow them to explore in an open-ended way. It gives money to address the questions that they convince us are important. So I think it is tough, but I think there would at least be some discussion around those issues.
So you want it to be watertight?
Well, I think it's a balance, yes. And in fact, it's not just me, it's that two of the reviewers raised this question that would you really believe that you don't know this technique will work? And then, of course, if it doesn't, you're in strong. As it happens, it does have a contingency, which is to switch to an overexpression system, which almost certainly will work. Whether or not it will be interesting just to overexpress estrogens in some bit of the brain is less clear. The other thing, which I thought it was a good piece of grantsmanship, but several reviewers were also their pernickety in saying, well, okay, this connection with schizophrenia, how good a model is an E18, an 18-day-old embryo, cortical neuron, grown in culture for a couple of weeks, how good a model of an adult complex brain dysfunction is that likely to be? And obviously, for this panel, it's very useful to have a translational aspect. That's one of the things that we see as very positive about these grants. It's whether or not this made a very strong case for that translation. I was slightly less keen, having seen these criticisms. Just wearing my MRC, I would say one more thing, and then I'll pass it on. I think that the travel costs and the consumable costs are high, and the MRC, this is public money we're giving out. This application is the cost of quite a nice house in most parts of the country, and yet he wants £157,000 for consumables for 1.2 postdoc, 1.2 workers for 3 years. I would say was at the generous end. And the 10K of travel for 2 people, it's him and the postdoc, 2 meetings a year, also seemed generous. And in a terribly penny-pinching way, they're the kind of things that get snipped quite often. Any other comments? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to clarify because when I was presenting the previous proposal by Lau, you said, I suggested that pilot work will be important. So why would you concede for this trial pilot work and not for the Lau?
It's not. I think pilot work is important for all grants, especially if there's any doubt about whether or not the work is technically achievable.
Yeah, that's precisely what I felt it was the case with Lau.
Okay. Well, I would, when we marked it down on that basis.
No, I just wanted to clarify the principle for the panel. Yeah. If we feel that there is a good piece of work but needs pilot work,
yes,
would we be prepared to suggest that we fund that?
Normally, it can't be good to fund work that you think is deficient and is not competitive. It's competing with other grants. In any meeting, there will always be a few grants that seem to be technically almost perfect, and so they will achieve the higher scores. So if a grant has defects, like a lack of pilot data that doesn't give you confidence about it, you must score it down, which we did. And if it was scored down, then we'd have a choice about whether to encourage renewal. So in fact, an important job of the panel is to provide feedback to the applicants who are unsuccessful, as well as those very nice phone calls to people who are successful.
Yeah.
And so that feedback, I think, then becomes very important. How do you help people? So I think we'd feel a special responsibility for a new investigator to encourage.
No, I was asking you.
Yeah.
I was asking you as a reviewer. I wanted to have your advice as a chairman of the panel.
Yes.
Do you want us to suggest some different courses of action? Like, for instance, suggest that perhaps, pilot work will be acceptable and we should, try to fund that kind of work.
I think pilot data is an integral part of making a convincing argument. I think less useful are, and you do see that quite often, reviewers saying, oh, well, I wouldn't do it this way. If I'd do it a different way, because I think that's, and so that may be a useful suggestion. If you think you could help an applicant because you're providing, the external reviewers are providing feedback to the applicant that they can address and they can either adopt. So I think in Carmen's grant, you had a feedback which you did accept, and you said, yeah, we'll do that. We'll try and change our recruitment if the numbers are low, so that you can reject it. But it's very difficult for us as a board to provide an alternative narrative that the applicants don't know about. It's really not our job to write their grants for them.
No.
It's very difficult if we try to do that.
No, I accept that. It's just, I feel that, if you have a bunch of proposals, several of which require pilot work, I think at the end, when we have an overall view of all the proposals, maybe we can decide which ones we are prepared to fund for pilot work. Would that be acceptable?
Oh, you mean actually fund the first part of the study?
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, that does happen, but I think, in my experience, and maybe the managers can tell us, that there's a resistance to fiddling too much with grants. So, exceptionally, if we felt the question was important and that there was just one critical point that limited its execution, we might suggest that. But normally, the grant stands or falls on its merits. Yeah.
Okay.
Normally you could feedback and say it requires preliminary data, and you could invite an early resubmission. But I think that's common to set a milestone.
Yeah. Or the other option, occasionally grants can get approved.
Can you hear it?
The grants could get approved, and some board chairs are more keen on pruning than others. I've definitely, the other boards I've worked in, previous chairs have liked pruning, but pruning has to be done on a scientific basis. So if everybody likes aims 1 to 3 but sees aim 4 as weak, then they could make the scoring based on, we'll fund aims 1 to 3, and you score it just on that. So that could be one option as well, but we wouldn't be able to mess with it going forward. So once it's been scored, that's it. That's the final answer. You can't, at ranking, for example, say, "Oh, we did like that one, but what let it down was aim 4. So maybe if we get rid of it now, it could have a more fundable score." You have to make that decision up front before it's scored.
On a related thing, so it'd be easy to say, yeah, we'll fund you, but we're only going to give you 5k for travel instead of 10, and obviously that. But if you were saying, well, we'll fund it, but we're going to cut in half what you can pay for your postdoc, so quite a big. Would you ever do that? Quite a big cut in the budget.
I think
again, only if it was based on the science. It has to be based on.
But would you then invite the applicant to sort of revise their costings, and they may say, no, I can't do it for less than, you know, $1 million, in which case you'd say, well, goodbye, or do you say, we'll give you the money on condition that you can do it for this this budget?
So I think quite often people are asked to justify their budgets.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've seen cases where they are offered a reduced budget,
yeah.
and I don't know how often they say no to that. Not often.
No.
I mean, it's not bargain basement. It's making a real point that if you are paying £200 for an oxygen cylinder, you're buying it from the wrong place, and so you know, please go and buy it from the right place. Yeah.
But I guess there comes a point you say, look, it's not value for money, therefore, no.
See, Steve, in this case, he's asking for £25,000 for access to the imaging centre. Do you think that's excessive?
No, well, I thought we use that imaging centre. It's £25 an hour, I think, which I think is reasonable. So I'd actually rolled that up with the other consumable costs. So that's why I've got to a figure of whatever it was, 160,000. No, that's a real consumable cost, and the rates are not extreme. A few years ago, the research councils as a whole had a concordat, in which they picked on King's as having too high animal costs. So there it was feasible. You can ask how much it costs to keep a mouse or a rat for a week in its hotel in different institutions. And at one time, King's was very expensive. And mysteriously, those prices came down because of exactly this kind of penny pinching analysis. It was just not reasonable that we should be asking for twice as much as another Russell Group university based in a big metropolitan area.
But generally, we wouldn't question institutional costs like imaging costs if it's that much an hour. We take that as read.
Sometimes it's easier if it's been done at triage, where somebody says, "Oh, you're using the wrong thing. Why don't you go and get a quote from someone else?" Okay, good. So, just for the fun of it, since we're slashing everything today, can we have a score for this note then? Deb?
Somewhere between 8 and 9. I'll give it a 9.
Okay. I'd give it an 8. Any other?
8. 8 for me.
So 8 is really sort of sitting on the fence. Alrighty, so we do have one more grant. Do we have time for more discussion? I mean, Catherine is...
I can keep this quite short.
Yeah, okay, why don't we have one? So this is a different type of grant that was submitted some time ago under a different under a different type of application form, basically. So it probably looks and feels very different from the others. Catherine?
I think the case for support. The case for support. Can you hear me at the back? No. I was just going to say, I think you'll find the case for support very familiar in there. So I'm going to be quite short on this one because I think this fits into the category of something that Steve just called the technically almost perfect grant, and the reviewers think that too. So this is a well-crafted proposal from Emmanuel Peters to look at a novel model for psychotic symptoms as a continuum and compare this between psychotic patients, individuals scoring highly on psychotic questionnaires, and healthy controls. And it's a very innovative study because they're going much further than just measuring symptoms on questionnaires and putting this into an experimental study. And this is building on very long-standing work from this research group and fills a very distinct gap in our understanding of psychotic experiences. And they're aiming specifically to test how interpretations of psychotic-like anomalies differentiate between these three groups of people. And they're going to carry out two really interesting experimental studies. First of all, inducing the idea in the participants that the computer has read your your mind, and secondly, presenting them with supposedly auditory hallucinations. And this is not my field, but it came across very, very clearly in the applications. The reviewers were obviously very supportive of this group. The study is very well designed, 2 centres at the Maudsley and at Bangor to make sure they got a diversity of participants. The undiagnosed group, is that middle group with the high symptom scores, will consist of 140 patients, and here I think the power calculations have been very carefully done. They've very carefully put a conservative p-value threshold, and then they've inflated their number of individuals quite substantially because they know that this might be a difficult study to recruit from. So I was reasonably reassured as a statistician that the power calculations were appropriate there. The reviewers have made very positive comments on the study. They declared it novel, likely to have a significant impact on our understanding of the interaction between these appraisals and psychosocial and psychotic features. And they commended the care that had gone into designing the study and writing the application. And I would agree with that. It's very straightforward and very clear exactly what they're going to do. The only major criticism in the reviews was on the statistical analysis, which was very simplistic and very limited, and they've taken this on board. They've responded very clearly in their 3 pages, and they now involve Dr. Daniel Stahl from the Biostatistics Department, who's an expert in the structural equation modelling, and I think that really strengthens this aspect of the study and takes away the only concerns I had about it.
Okay, so an important area. Any other comments? If not, Catherine, what would you score it?
I would score this a 9.
I would give it a 9.
I was just going to say, the weakness that I see is that it's not integrated enough with psychiatric care and medication and the sort of standard models of care. So that would weaken it slightly from my point of view, even though it's experimental.
So the score then?
So 8.
Just to finish the charade.
Yeah, I actually gave it a 7, but I don't have time to explain why.
No.
As someone from outside this field, I found it very easy to read, surprisingly easy to read, and I think it's a good model of a grant to aspire to. I'd give it a 9.
Okay. So obviously the scoring in reality is done secretly and anonymously. The reviewers tell, they give an assessment and they give a numerical value that they attach to that assessment for the guidance of the whole panel, and then a bit like governance, the panel are supposed to take collective responsibility by all voting for something, even when they're not experts in the field. They're summarising the feeling of the meeting. So the whole process is it's the panel is making the decision. We're not just slavishly following the external review scores, which we could do in 5 minutes. I mean, it would be very easy, but not very meaningful. Great, so I'm pleased to say that one thing's been funded probably. Good. Does that help you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we've got the scores up there. So Peter's score 9, rank number 1, and second comes Srivastavas, 8, and third is Parianti, 7, as a medium point, and the last one is Laos at score 6. Okay. So.
Well, that's obviously not what happened.
No. Okay.
I do think that over time the bar is going up because the funding rates, there's a limited amount of money. So it's more important to have a kind of, so that's, in a way, if there's any real value in this exercise today, it's that you have to strive to not fall into any of these pit holes. It's terrible, right? The funding rates are just, they're low. Yeah? We're funding things that, we're only funding a fraction of the things that are deemed to be important and worthy of funding in general.
Rebecca, do you want to comment?
Could I ask a question of Rebecca? You mentioned that there were 23 people on the board. and only 2 or 3 people, board members, will have read the grant in detail and presented on it. To what extent is there a kind of groupthink that people follow the recommendations or the suggestions of the chief reviewers?
So we would hope that maybe more than just 3 people would have read it. So in addition, there'd be the chair and the deputy chair who definitely would have read it as well, and we would hope that others are able to chip in where there's relevance to their field as well. And that does actually, that happens pretty frequently, that other people's comment as well. Groupthink came up in our unconscious bias training, so that's part of training for board members, not to give in to groupthink mentality. Also, if people have an idea of their score in their mind, they are welcome to score away from the recommended score, but if it's 2 scores away from what's been recommended, they need to have flagged it up and they need to have said why. So if everybody else wants to score at 8 but you want to score at 2, you're very welcome to, but you need to have said why you think there's a critical flaw in it that you'd only give 2. So everybody isn't expected to score identically to the scores suggested, but you need to have aired any problems you have before you got to that point.
I think we take a couple of questions from the audience. Coming.
Just clarify the process. So the individuals, members of the panel, score anonymously. Mm-hmm. So in theory, you could. Good practice would be to share a kind of a flow on the graph, but you could just decide to vote 2 and not say anything. Nobody would notice or pick it up. No.
So we have it's all hooked up to a laptop at the front, and there'll be a member of staff at the front who can see all the scores as they come in, and they will notice if somebody has scored that far away from the scores that have been suggested, and then we'd go back to them and question why that is.
The 3 presenter scores are not anonymous. They are invited to tell the panel what they would score, obviously, and why, because they've been analysing the grant.
Can I ask a question about kind of power calculation statistics? Because I think, especially for people that are doing, I guess it's the same for everybody, but for biological research and biomarker in particular, it's really a big issue because, I can tell that I'm going to recruit 100 patients and only measure IL-6. But everybody knows I'm lying because it's cheaper to measure 50 cytokines than 1, and I probably have good hypotheses on all of them. So I guess the question is it about having a clear hypothesis, so that my main hypothesis is that actually this difference will be in IL-6, but it will also measure another 50 just to kind of get further signal, exploratory ideas and so on? Or do you really think that we should mention no more than 3 or 4 things that we measure? Because it's a real struggle in terms of...
I think it's really hard, I agree. I think my concern comes when I read a power calculation which is naive, perhaps, in relation to what the study's going to collect and the analysis that they're going to do. And that mismatch there just makes me worry that the investigators don't understand the analysis side well enough, that the study's not well enough designed. So I'm always slightly more sympathetic if it comes across as this is an exploratory study, this is our primary hypothesis, but while we've got all these people, we're going to measure this as well and do secondary analyses here. But I think I think those 3 areas of the application have to tie up very closely: the design, the statistical analysis, and the power calculations. That has to come across as a coherent whole, and when it doesn't, that's what worries me.
I do think it's getting more tough. So the Neuroscience Board, the Mental Health Board, we more or less agreed that things will be turned down at triage if they don't meet some minimum standards of power calculations. So I think if people are worried, it's a hoop they're going to have to jump through. So it will be good to start planning for that now.
Can I just come in there? First of all, I think it's fantastically helpful to have a proper statistician on your team to help you work that out. On the other hand, I also think it is true that the idea of the power calculation is extremely simple and easily to apply to a clinical trial, and it is much less intuitive when you're talking about lots of other kinds of research, and I think sometimes we're slightly intimidated by, and then we end up with sort of slightly meaningful power calculations because we've got to put in something into that box. Can I just get Carmini while he was there? Because first of all, it's just fantastic that people have given us their grants and sat through this process. But seeing that you are there and you're co-chair of the RIC, I mean, do you think that, what have you learned having done the study that would have made the peer review process better, or would have made the... I'm sure if we'd said, how would you write your grant now if you were doing it all over again, I'm sure there would be differences. But do you want to comment on some of that?
I mean, it's interesting because obviously I haven't read this for years now, and now I'm looking. I think, how could I have written something like this? And certainly the study designs and make sure that you have the right comparison. And there's a mismatch between what I thought I've written and what I actually wrote. So there's also, I think, which I think is about writing, assuming that other people will understand. So I think that when I was writing it, I thought that what I wanted to do was so clear that actually wasn't clear, because you immediately raise it, the comparison between the groups is a problem. So it's just kind of, for me, it was really important to think about, obviously, even thinking them have been very clear, I've not been very clear. And so this always asking whether you're clear enough, and you all made comments on Emmanuel's grant just because of how easy it was to read. And so is that element.
Did you recruit to numbers? Did it turn out like that?
I did recruit the numbers. Yeah. We were writing the papers. We found lots of differences, so it was powered enough to do it. But actually, I didn't do the analysis were different. At the end, I did compare the one who developed fatigue versus the one that didn't develop fatigue. So,
thanks.
So peer review is very important. Any other urgent questions? No? Well, let's thank the panel members for their great...